My name is Tomeu Stolrich. I am the director of the Center for Ignatian Spirituality. This past summer, I was finally invited to participate at the Intersections Villa Faculty Writing Seminar. The people who has attended the retreat will know why I'm saying finally. It is not that easy to get into that retreat, even for me, who work with Bert Howell, that I see just right there. So during the retreat, there are not so many moments for socializing. Except for during drinks and dinners, everyone is very much alone doing their research projects. So I did not have the chance to talk to Franco Mormando, who was doing that retreat as well, till the very last day, actually the last 20 minutes of the retreat. However, those 20 minutes became very productive. During the brief conversation that we held, he told me about his personal interest in connecting the roots of the Society of Jesus with those of the Ignatian Order, of the Franciscan Order, stating almost in passing that Ignatian spirituality was in many ways an evolution, not a revolution. That topic, and definitely that sentence, caught my attention. So I asked him if he would be interested in giving a lecture at the center. And it seems, looking around this room, that I'm not the only one intrigued by the topic and probably by the sentence. Franco Mormando is professor of Italian, chair of the Romance Languages and Literatures Department, and affiliate faculty at the Department of History. He holds a BA from Columbia University, a MA and a PhD in Romance Languages and Literatures from Harvard University, and a licentiate in theology from the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, among other many things. Franco has specialized on the religious art and culture of early modern Italy, and his current research interest is in the Italian Baroque artist Gian Lorenzo Bernini. So please join me in welcoming our speaker.
For 35 years ago or more, when I was a I started my PhD at Harvard in Italian literature, 1979 to 1983, and I did a dissertation on a Franciscan, a big one, an important one, an influential one. We'll hear more about him, San Bernardino da Siena. San Bernardino, California is named after him, by the way. And so I was immersed in Bernardino and his writings and Franciscan spirituality. I'm probably one of the few people on this planet who has read every sermon by Bernardino da Siena. Yes, I don't know how I did it, but I did. Then later, when I encountered Jesuit spirituality, some of you may know I was a member of the Society of Jesus for 20 years, I kept having the same experience. Wait a minute, I've heard this before in Franciscan spirituality. So I began putting together a file that I've been filling for decades. And it just, that conversation that Tomeo referred to was the moment in which I said, I can finally do something about this. Now, I have to tell you that you're all participating in a subversive moment, because the bottom line is, Society of Jesus, Jesuits, we love you dearly, but you're not completely as original as some of you think you are. And that the sources are in St. Francis. Now, full disclosure, my brother is a Capuchin, he was on sabbatical in wonderful Spello, and does wonderful work. He's a real Franciscan. He worked in the South Bronx for many years, cheerfully dodging bullets. So this is in honor of my brother Nick, who was a little boy, and it's hard to believe that now he's a courageous Franciscan working with immigrants at the moment. Okay, here's our protagonist. Ignatius of Loyola. This is not a portrait of Ignatius by Rubens. It's a portrait of Chasuble by Rubens. Really. clearly the artist was more interested in that. And then our other hero of the moment is St. Francis of Assisi. On the left, the earliest portrait in the Benedictine monastery of Subiaco, and then the one in probably by Cimabue in Assisi. In Ignatius's childhood, in early modern Europe, it was impossible not to know Ignatius. Francis. I'm going to be mixing up the two names constantly. Francis was one of the most popular saints, one of the most popular saints in Christianity. Even non-Catholics revere him. And then also think about it. In Counter-Reformation Europe, there weren't that many religious orders. The multiplicity of religious orders happened in the 16th century. So before then, in the 15th century, the two big ones were the Dominicans and the Franciscans. There were others like the Servites and the Augustinians, but certainly the Franciscans and the Dominicans, but in this case, the Franciscans were a prominent presence in the early life of Francis, and I'll spell that out more quickly. By the way, I'm going fast because I want to really leave room for questions and answers. I'm eager to hear your responses. You could not escape Francis. There were many scenes of the life of Francis in art so that even the illiterate could know him. These are some of my favorite scenes of the life of Francis by late 16th century Flemish artists. Beautiful renditions. But more importantly, does anyone know where these are? Pam. The Church of the Jesuit, a whole chapel in the Jesuit Mother Church of the Jesuit. It's way in the back, ordered by St. Francis Borgia, the Father General who was named after Francis and who was a Third Order member before he became a Jesuit. It's now, in the early 20th century, it was rededicated to the Sacred Heart, but the Francis images are still there. The Franciscans among you will notice something peculiar about the depiction of the Franciscans. What kind of Franciscans are they? Capuchins. There was a relationship between the Jesuits and the Capuchins in the history of the order that needs to be studied more. In any case, my talk is going to be divided into two parts. One will be naming the historical or biographical context between Ignatius and Franciscans and their spirituality and charism. So this is the historical part. Part two will be about the reflections of that in Jesuit documents and the Jesuit way of proceeding and all of that. We know Ignatius was a Basque. He lived in a small world in the corner in the Basque territory. He lived in a time and a place that was permeated with Franciscans and Franciscan values, Franciscan spiritualities. I need not point out anything more than one of the most powerful people in the region was Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros, who he was the kind of figure that that later Jesuits would become. Polymaths, powerful, public intellectuals, politically involved. He was regent, ruling the government for a while. So there are many instances of the Jesuits the Franciscans occupying the kind of literary, intellectual, political roles that we would associate later with Jesuits. I've called a list of the specific contacts, very intimate contacts between Ignatius in his childhood and his early years, let's leave it as that, constant and omnipresent. But they're not very studied. Biographies of Ignatius tend to go over very quickly the first years of his life. One, we don't know as much, but also because of the bad influence of Ribadeneyra and the published version of Ignatius' memoirs, which skip over very quickly his early life because they may contain some inconvenient truths. Maybe one of the inconvenient truths is the Franciscan influence there. But anyway, there are relatives. I can't. We don't have the time, but I can. I'm happy to send this out if you want. I scoured the printed sources. There are thousands of printed articles about Ignatius and the Jesuits. There are only 2 small discussions of this with no footnotes, very quickly in these 2 works, De Lecturia, and then a very good biography, but without footnotes, unfortunately, by a Basque historian who really recreates the Basque and years and mentality and even the topography of Francis's life. So without reading that list, know that there were many reasons why and many occasions in which Ignatius encountered the Franciscans. He had aunts and cousins who were founders of convents, patronesses. They were Third Order members. The Franciscans ran local parishes and sanctuaries. Now, the image is that before his conversion, as he says himself, Ignatius was given up to the vanities of the world. And one might assume, well, he was a libertine or an atheist. No such thing. It was impossible in that small Catholic world for anyone to be a libertine or an atheist. He was fully grounded in Catholic spirituality. He went with his family to devotions. He went to Mass. He heard sermons. And a lot of all of that bore the stamp of the Franciscans. We know the dramatic turnabout in his life. He gets wounded in battle. He's sick for many years. He starts reading, and he reads the lives of the saints, and Ludolphus of Saxony's life of the saints. More about that later. Ludolphus, we know, is a Carthusian. So what? He's a Carthusian, not a Franciscan. There is a Franciscan behind this. After his conversion, one of the first things he does is go to the sanctuary of the Marian sanctuary of Aranzazu. Who ran the sanctuary? Everyone? Franciscans. And then the general pattern on a certain level of abstraction, the pattern of Ignatius's life is a pattern of Francis. He rejects his aristocratic, wealthy background. He embraces abject, radical poverty. He goes to the Holy Land to convert the heathens and non-believers, but he gets thrown out by whom? The Franciscans, because they were guardians of the Holy Land. He experiences rapture, even though he never had the stigmata, and he founds an order. And in fact, there's a similar scene of Francis, like Ignatius, Ignatius, like Francis, had to go to Rome and prove that this unknown, unkempt, rag-dressed person had something to say to the Pope and had an order to found. And just by the sheer charisma, Francis and Ignatius convinced the Pope that yes, the hand, as is said in the Ignatian literature, the hand of God is here. Another contact was, well, like any good Catholic, especially the head of soon to be the head of an order, needs a confessor. Who was Ignatius's confessor? Or better, what order did he belong to? The Franciscans. We know this very carefully. It's a man. We know his name. It's in San Pietro in Montorio on the Janiculum, a beautiful church. It's one of the Spanish national churches today. There was the Academy of Spain is there. Romans know it because it's a very popular scene for weddings. So that's it on the right. But on the left is a scene from the life of Ignatius, which demonstrates one of his miracles. The miracle is that he was one of the father's close brethren, Coduria, I think. What's his name? Codurio, I believe his name is. Codurius in Latin, is sick and dying. So Francis says, calls another brethren with him and said, let's go up to San Pietro to pray for him. So a dear friend, Jesuit brother, is dying, and where does he go? To a Franciscan church. This is included in the miracles of St. Ignatius, because on the way there, and that's what this image shows, you can see San Pietro in the distance. Ignatius has a vision of Giovanni, his name is, going up into heaven and says to his brother, let's go home, our brother has just died. So in rapid summary, there are the historical biographical points of contacts. I haven't spelt all of them out, but they are, you put them all together, they are many and deep and significant and had an influence. So part 2. The Franciscan presence in Ignatian spirituality, way of proceeding, mission, imagery, everything. So what does Ignatian spirituality owe to the Franciscans? Well, first of all, and most obvious is the embracing of radical poverty, which we see both in Francis and in Ignatius. This issue of poverty was absorbed more easily in the Jesuit order than it did in the Franciscans, because, as you know, the issue of radical and poverty tore the Franciscan order apart. Their conventuals, the fraticelli, which were branded heretics, who became, I should have notes, I had a graph, who were the spirituali were separate from the fraticelli, Franciscans, yes? Okay, anyway, the order was torn into asunder because the big issue was, well, we are imitating Christ. Did Christ embrace radical poverty? And this was important for many reasons. If you're going to imitate Christ, well, they took it to the Pope. Big mistake, because you think the Pope is going to say yes. The Vatican, marble, gold, and all of that. And the Pope said, and I have nothing against that. I love it. It's a gift to humanity that the church. No, really, I'm serious about this. People challenge me all the time. It's a gift to humanity that so much beauty, which to many people exudes some form of spirituality, is there and has been protected. However, the Pope said, no, Jesus did not embrace radical poverty. So that put an end to that question. However, it still was a problem in the Franciscan order. It was not a problem, not a terrible one in the Jesuit order. I'll get to that in a moment. So this is the famous fresco of Francis marrying Lady Poverty, which is a scene popularized by Dante's Divine Comedy. These engravings come from a very popular life of Ignatius that has numerous editions and easily found on Google by the Google Books. And this shows scenes from his embracing of radical poverty. It gets codified in the constitutions. And in the preamble to the constitutions, Ignatius says, the constitutions teach us to counter the lust of the eyes with poverty, lust for material goods, and our observance of poverty, which is so strict that neither churches nor professed houses may acquire any rents, lands, or even perpetual endowments. And then in the spiritual exercises by Ignatius, in the Nativity, in the contemplation of the Nativity, one of the important elements is the fact that Jesus was born and lived in poverty. Now, the dilemma in the Society of Jesus, which was also in the Order of Friars Minor, is, okay, we live poorly, but what about our churches? How much should our churches reflect our embracing of poverty? And the Franciscans, for instance, they originally said, we cannot build any churches with the elaborate wooden ceilings, which are beautiful and usually polychromed, because that would be against poverty and send out the wrong message. In the end, aesthetics, art, beauty won out. I'm glad. But of course, the Jesuits outdid the Franciscans in the Baroque. What would the founders say? I leave that questions for you to answer. There's a tomb of Ignatius, and there's a tomb of Francis in Assisi. Now, let me go back. We'll go back to the question of the churches when we speak about the image theory, but there is justification for the decoration of the churches. The idea basically was you are to create a space that which will transport the viewer into a different realm, into the heavenly realm, when all goes well. But as Jesuit General Giovanni Paolo Oliva wrote in the 1680s, after the Jesuit had been Baroquicized, he complains that there are too many people who go to churches and look at the paintings as works of art and not for the spiritual message as today. Okay, enough of that. Okay, point 2, point 1, poverty. Point 2, the very name and seal of the society. This is the most obvious borrowing of the Jesuits of Franciscan spirituality and iconography. Here's the seal of the society on the mother church of the Jesuit in Rome. I forget where that is, but that's a typical rendition. Here's a very beautiful one. I know the artist. Does anyone know where this is? This is in the entrance to St. Mary's Hall. Really very pretty. But the root is Franciscan. Bernardino of Siena. The name of the society and the cult of and the iconography of the IHS monogram was the direct, explicit, well-documented invention or creation of San Bernardino of Siena, the most popular preacher in late Renaissance, early or late medieval Italy, who was back then was also called the third founder of the order, Francis, Bonaventure, and Bernardino, because he took the nascent observant branch and made it soon into one of the most popular branches of the Franciscan Order. In fact, the observant Franciscans were very popular in the Iberian Peninsula. So not only do we have Franciscan influence on Ignatius, but observant Franciscan influence. Bernardino decided to create this very eye-catching monogram as an antidote to all the partisan emblems and symbols that he saw in churches. He says in one sermon, I went into church, there was a coat of arms of some political faction leader family, and it was right above Jesus crucified. And I said to myself, that family is pissing on you, Lord God. That's how Bernardino pronounced himself. Yes, he did. That's what made him popular. Also, like Ignatius, Ignatius, like Bernardino, said no Jesuit is to take any clerical office of honor. Those 3 bishops' mitres refer to the fact that he refused 3 bishoprics. He was dead set against ecclesiastical honors. One historian, without a footnote, however, said that the IHS monogram was on Ignatius's crib. I haven't looked around for pictures of it, but I haven't seen it. Tomeo, the next time you go to Loyola, look for the crib. But that's not surprising because it was soon permeated society as not only a symbol of Jesus and a powerful powerful invocation, but it was also seen as an apotropaic symbol, meaning you wear this, put on over your door, put on your crib, and it wards off evil. That's what apotropaic means. So when in Rome, Ignatius was surrounded by Franciscans. One of the central church, one of the most important Franciscan churches is right in the heart of the civic center of Rome on the Campidoglio, the Capitoline, Santa Maria in Araceli, and there was a chapel, the San Bernardino Chapel, first on the left, with magnificent frescoes painted by Pinturicchio, a great Renaissance painter. It was redone in the 1960s or 70s by Iris Origo, who wrote one of the nice books on Bernardino, whom I had the pleasure of getting to know her in her last days when she was living in the Teatro di Marcello. Very nice. Any case, here's a scene, famous scene of Bernardino. These are the things when you're a doctoral student, you look for these pleasures to relieve the boredom of being in the library all day. You get to have tea with the Marchese Origo, who was very gracious. In any case, there is Bernardino at the end of his sermon holding up the monogram, IHS monogram for devotion. And there it is. He designed it himself. When I first went to Italy or Europe and I saw the monogram all over, I said, wow, these Jesuits are all over the place. No. Bernardino was all over the place. And here's a lesson of history, church history. Today's heresy is tomorrow's orthodoxy. Bernardino was criticized for this new heretical Judaizing devotion because they said it had to do with the tetragrammaton, Yahweh, and all, and that was enough. That was a cheap shot. If you wanted to throw dirt on someone, you just say they were Judaizing. But he went to Rome. He was put on trial. He won. He said, "When I went to Rome, half the people wanted me roasted. The other half wanted me fried. But with the grace of God, I triumphed." And we have the IHS today. IHS are the letters, abbreviation for the Greek form of the name of Jesus. It's the I in the here, Y, is the late Gothic form of I, Jesus, I-E. There's an H in it. I haven't spelled it out, but in any case, Gothic letters, Jesus. It drives me absolutely crazy when people say that, oh no, IHS stands for Jesus Hominum Salvator. Even Jesuits say it. A student of Holy Cross told me that's what he was told by the Jesuits of Holy Cross College. It's not true, especially since it represents the name of the society. What in the world does Jesus Hominum Salvator have to do with the name of the society? Jesus is the name of the society. Basta. However, I have to admit that in one of the most popular bestsellers, 100 years, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Society of Jesus, they had problems with, whoever wrote this in the Belgian province, in its emblem about the society's seal, they don't talk about Jesus, they talk about the cross, pointing to the crucifix above it, the cross above it. Be that as it may, read my entry on the IHS monogram in the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the Jesuits. I also wrote the entry on Boston College there, by the way. Okay, another point, and I'll be done in 10 minutes the most. Contemplation of place and application of senses. Everyone should know this if you're here. In the spiritual exercises, Ignatius has the exercitant, the one during the retreat, go through the life of Jesus and imagine being on the scene, contemplate the scene, which means really look at it and feel it and apply your senses. What are you smelling? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? This is not a Jesuit or Ignatian invention. It is at least by then 200 years old. I'll get to the origins in a while, but here's how it happened. Here's what we can trace, or what is usually said in the literature. Ignatius was sick. He read pious works, Ludolphus of Saxony's Life of the Saints. Ludolphus is a Carthusian, and that's that. Well, a couple of things. He could not read it in Latin. He read it in a Spanish translation by Ambrosio Montesino, who is a Franciscan. He was, but there's more to it. It doesn't end there. Not just a translation thing. Again, Ambrosio was one of those incredible, accomplished polymaths, clerics, who was a public intellectual. He wrote music, he wrote poetry, he was part of the court for a while, the court of Isabella. One of Isabella's ladies of waitings was, I said, the aforementioned aunt of Ignatius, Doña Marina de Guevara, who became a Poor Clare nun. I didn't mention that. But Ambrosio was very important. He was a Franciscan, highly placed. Again, he was called a troubadour of God. He was, again, one of those figures, religious figures, whom later would, the kind of role that later the Jesuits would fulfill. However, Ludolphus of Saxony plagiarized his work. I think something like at least 50%. My mind is telling me 60, but I'll be more careful. I'll be more conservative. He plagiarized another earlier bestseller, the Meditazione Vitae Christi, written by whom? Now we know it's Giovanni de Caulibus, OFM. For many years he was just called a pseudo-Bonaventure, which made the work even more popular. And lo and behold, we read, going through the life of Christ, we read the author saying, oh, by the way, he wrote it originally for Franciscan sisters, but it was used by everyone. You can't, every library has a copy of this. It's been translated numerous times. And he says, enter into the Nativity. Look around. What are you seeing? What is Mary feeling? What are you smelling? Etc., etc. Simply make yourself present in the very place where, before your eyes, it occurs to your mind that events were taking place. Contemplation of place, application of senses. We don't have the time to go through more examples of it, but yes, the idea of entering affectively and sensorially into the gospel in order to have it penetrate your heart and there convert your soul goes back to the Meditazione Vitae Christi of 1300. Circa. Okay, next point. I call it image theory, meaning using images to educate, to move, to delight, to persuade. To teach, to delight, and persuade, that threefold objective actually comes from ancient rhetoric, Quintilian and then Cicero, much used in the early modern period as to define not only oratory, which was the original context, but church art. Well, that's what, even before it was articulated in the late Renaissance and Baroque, people knew that, and the Franciscans knew it, and that's why they hired wonderful, accomplished artists, the best artists, like Giotto, to cover their churches with deeply moving scenes of the life of Christ or the saints, etc. So we don't have a body of literature written by Franciscans detailing their image theory, but it was there very quickly. As part of this, and also as part of contemplation of place, I suppose, or application of senses, they popularized the nativity scenes, stations of the cross, which are three-dimensional visual representations. This is all part of, you can call it the image theory or three-dimensional composition of place, face to face. Then, according to St. Bonaventure's Life of Francis, in 1223, Francis enacted the first living nativity scene in Greccio, Umbria. And the rest is history. The nativity, the creches or the presepi in Italian has become an industry in itself. Extravaganzas. Go to the Metropolitan Museum during Christmas and you see that magnificent Neapolitan Baroque creche. But this all goes back to Francis and his desire to make the gospel real in an affective, sensorial way. One of the delights of being in Rome during the Christmas period, and I lived there for 2 years, is to go from church to church to see the creches. It's almost funny how the churches compete with each other for the their elaborate creche scenes. They even have signs on the outside. presepio with automatico, with con luci, with sound and light. It's wonderful. Okay, another point. The Jesuits are contemplatives in action. We know that. Is that a new thing that Ignatius thought up? No. Bernardino of Siena talks about this. And again, many of you may not know Bernardino, but he's one of those figures who was enormously popular and, more important, influential in his day. Count the number of manuscripts we have of his works. He wrote an enormous amount in Latin for sermon models for future preachers that cover 9 volumes. So he was consulted. As soon as printing became available, his works were his Opera Omnia were published in the late 15th century, twice in the 16th century, at least once in the 17th century, and again in the 18th century, and then the culmination was the Quaracchi critical edition in the 1950s, which is what we have in the library, in which, when I refer to 9 volumes, I refer to that, because Bernardino was being prepared to be declared a doctor of the Church. And the Curia had said, the Vatican had said, yes, we can go ahead and, let's proceed with this. But as one Franciscan historian said, then Vatican II came along, and Bernardino's doctorate was swallowed up in the vortex of Vatican II. In any case, he talks about the need of joining contemplation and action, of being a contemplative in action. This is in a very wonderful article by a learned scholar, San Bernardino, the humanist, and San Bernardino Siena. It was my first published article as a fresh scholar, fresh out of nowhere. Okay, and by the way, Bernardino was a poor, observant, ascetic observant, but he did not believe in sancta rusticitas, and he talks about the need for a learned clergy. In fact, he has a famous joke about 2 uneducated country priests saying, at the consecration, what do you say? Hoc est corpustus meusus? And the other one says, no, that's wrong. It's hoc est corpusum meusum. And the third one says, I don't bother, I just say Hail Mary and that's it. Bernardino says that. Okay, we're coming to an end. Were Ignatius's rules for the discernment of spirit the first of their kind, meaning a list of user-friendly, practical, specific rules to determine what's going on in your head? Is it the good angel or the bad angel? And he lists them in the spiritual exercises. What's the answer? No. Bernardino wrote a treatise, the Trattato delle Ispirazioni, De Inspirationibus, which are the first list, specific, concrete list. Do this, don't do this, depending on this, for the discernment of spirits. He realized that it was an important task, and he wrote De Inspirationibus. Admittedly, they're not very workable today, but he is the first. To find out more about it, you read another fine article by another fine scholar who's a professor of Italian at Boston College. Bernardino's there. Okay, and finally, a little thing. The image that was very popular earlier in the society, but nowadays it's too military to be talked about, that of laboring, militating under the standard of Jesus Christ, that image. And if you go to the aforementioned Imago Primi Saeculi, they talk about Ignatius loving that imagery of leading your mission behind the military banner of Christ. Well, Bernardino has a whole sermon cycle, De Pugna Spirituale, concerning the spiritual battle, and he has it there. So a tiny one. Okay, just one more thing. So the first Jesuit pope is also the first pope with the name of Francis. Thank you very much. We have a few moments for questions. If you have to, yes. Professor Elisa Rhodes. Yes, who does?
It's interesting that
Yeah, so Professor Rose brings up an important point, a generic point, and John McDowell was mentioning this too to me. Well, what about the things, significant things that the Jesuits did not take from the Franciscans, which marked them, made a mark on the order? And a big one is the decision not to create a third order of lay people, especially women. So that's one way that the Jesuits really distinguished themselves from the Franciscans. Yes. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Tommaso Santa Maria, doctoral student at Yale.
Would you say that the first Jesuits were more aware of the debt that they had to the Franciscans than maybe Jesuits are today? I mean, I'm thinking of the Camera life where he says, you know, Ignatius wanted to be like Francis and more. It was already kind of clear there was a certain debt to Francis. And also, I mean, I'm just thinking even the sermons of Robert Bellarmine, so many more sermons actually on Francis than on Ignatius, but that wouldn't really have surprised anyone. He was far more beloved.
Oh, this is another good question about the Jesuit awareness, the early Jesuit awareness about the debt of the society towards Francis. As far as I can tell, they paid lip service to it, but that's all there is. The fact that there are only 3 little articles, not even articles, just pages on this in the history of Jesuit literature scholarship. Interestingly enough, when I was in Rome, I went to the Vatican archive, the Jesuit archive, in the days when the old archivist, he was either Flemish or French, Lamal, who knew the archive left and right, and I wanted to see what there was in the archive about deliberations about naming the society, but more specifically coming up with the seal. And he said, oh, this is a good thing, I'll go in. He brought out all these files and he said, there's nothing. There are just images. There's nothing. I can't believe this. I don't know. You have to interpret the silence. Is it because they didn't want to acknowledge, or it was? He said, well, they didn't. It's not explicit because it was so much a part of in the air that there was no need to name it. People would have recognized it, perhaps. Yes, Christian.
Along that line, I guess we've sort of presupposed a narrative where the Jesuits are distinguishing themselves as being a unique order, innovator, and the rest. Is that how Ignatius and his followers have projected it? And to your point, where they said we're adopting a symbol that's been commonly used as a way of showing our continuity. We're all part of the same church, the same spiritual movement. What do you think Ignatius and his followers were?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't researched it in depth, but I do know that the Jesuits got resistance for daring to have for having the audacity, unlike any other order, to appropriate Jesus' name for themselves. Excuse me, we're all followers of Jesus. Why are you naming yourself after Jesus? That definitely did happen. But when I said I didn't research the question, I don't know how the Jesuits resolved that. Maybe they didn't answer it, they just went forward.
Judaizers in Spain, right? I mean, this is against the Inquisition, and obviously there's the heretics. Are you sympathetic towards Judaizers or not? How do they want to align themselves in that? Of course.
Yeah, this is to be studied. There was a medieval group called the Jesuati that still existed during Ignatius's time, and sometimes people mistake the two. So there was a precedent, but not on the level of what became soon a very major, prominent order rooted and headquartered in Rome. Yes?
I'm Jeff Miller.
A senior art historian, early modern period. Thank you for being here.
Brown University. Anyway, and I'm working on the topic of Jesuit accommodation, how they change according to the audiences they want to interact with. And in that research, I found that it seems like an almost willful suppression of Franciscan precedents when they take claim for using pictures, very simple pictures of heaven and hell, to convert Native Americans in Paraguay, and the great Franciscan Pedro de Gante had developed that technique almost a century earlier. So what I'm wondering about, and it relates to other questions that have been asked, is was there a conscious suppression of those precedents as part of a kind of political rivalry of the different orders?
That's a question to be researched by going to the documents. I doubt if you would find much, but I can tell you in early modern Europe, especially in Rome, but other places, there was definitely competition among the orders to get people in their churches. One of the reasons why the tomb of St. Ignatius is as elaborate as it is was because they were sorry that the previous tomb was not drawing any visitors. This we have it from an internal Jesuit document, which I quote in my last essay for that Fairfield exhibit on the Jesuit art, essays on Giampaolo Oliva. But they say, we got to get, basically, they say we have to get people into the Jesuit. We have to move the tomb to a more prominent place. So there was competition. There could have been suppression because of that. You don't want to help. You want to show your originality, your distinctiveness. So it would be an all too human reaction. Another thing that Jesuits did not take up, not beyond Ignatius, and I was talking to Francis Restuccia about this earlier. Franciscan spirituality is very affective. That's why it's more popular so popular in Italy and among Italians. Affective. I mean, yes, Jesuit art is supposed to move the emotions, but not to you don't see the presence, the same presence of the same attention to developing an affective approach and response to spirituality in Jesuit spirituality as you do in Franciscans. This is, people can debate this, but it's been my experience. Ignatius was crying all the time over Mass, but you go to a Jesuit formation and you're not told, make sure you cry. If you're not crying by the end of your formation, you're not a real Jesuit. I know we're running out of time, so we should probably end here. Thank you very much.